Our next conversation will be between Myra Green and Sean Michelle Smith. Myra Green is an associate professor of photography at Columbia College in Chicago. She holds a BFA from Washington University in St. Louis and an MFA in photography from the University of New Mexico. She has received an Illinois Arts Council fellowship in photography and has completed residencies at Lightwork in Syracuse, New York, and the Center for Photography in Woodstock, New York. Green's work has been featured in exhibitions including the New York Public Library, the Art Museum of the Americas in Washington, D.C., the Spelman College Museum of Fine Art in Atlanta, and the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. Her work is in the permanent collections of the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, and the New York Public Library. Sean Michelle Smith is Associate Professor and Graduate Director of Visual and Critical Studies at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. She is the author of several books, including Photography on the Color Line, W.E.B. Du Bois, Race and Visual Culture. She has co-edited Pictures in Progress, Early Photography and the Making of African American Identity, and her current book project, At the Edge of Sight, Photography and the Unseen, is soon to be published by Duke, as were her previous books. So, welcome. Thank you.
Hi. So I want to thank the Chicago Photography Working Group for such a great inaugural event, and I'm really pleased to be here talking with Myra Green today. Myra knows I'm a big fan of her work, and I think that the work that is on display in the exhibition, Character Recognition, is an especially good body of work to talk about the intersection of history and photography. And so I first want to sort of apologize. We wanted to have images present in this room while we were talking about the work. But two things. First of all, they're gigantic. And these, if you have looked in the gallery, are actually gorgeous, jewel-like, small ambrotype. So I feel like maybe I'm doing a little bit of maybe
it happens all the time.
It doesn't look great, like it's new.
You can't give a lecture without the pictures.
Yes, but I do encourage you to look at them. I think part of the strength of the work is their materiality as objects, so I hope people look at them in the gallery. And then I also, I can't resist setting up these little narratives between the pairing of images, so this little whisper into the ear that I've created as I was putting them together is maybe not so much part of the work, but part of the slide. Okay. So what I would like, I think that this work speaks both materially and thematically to history and photography, and the history of photography. And so I thought maybe as a way in, you could talk to us, start with the nitty-gritty, with the material, with the artifact nature, with the ambrotype.
Okay.
And why did you work it out there?
Okay, so in 2005 was when this project started, and I was living in Rochester, New York, home of Kodak. I was teaching at Rochester Institute of Technology, RIT, and it's a place where there's a multitude of photographic process at your fingertips at all the time. And also there's George Eastman House, and his title is The Historian of Photographic Processes. This is a man named Mark Osterman, and he would give these workshops on a variety of different photographic processes at his house, maybe every 6 weeks. And he's the man who taught Sally Mann how to do her ambrotypes. Like it's just like this is the guy. And so, as an ambitious photographer, I said, I want to learn this. I'll never use it. I'll just do this workshop and be like, yeah, I made these things on glass. They're totally cool. But there's a uniqueness, because what you're making is you're putting basically a silver gelatin object or a silver gelatin coat onto a clear glass plate. You're making a one-of-a-kind photographic object, which is so different than the processes that we do today. And so I was interested in uniqueness at the time. I'm always interested in materiality and objectness of photography. We often lose that idea because it's framed in black. And sort of also how the process always shows its process by marks and crud and stain, and that builds its uniqueness out. And so like on the bottom of this, this art on the bottom of that image is literally my finger, where the chemistry didn't go because my finger was holding the plate. And so there are all these marks of the everyday that I love. But when I learned to do the process, I don't know if I'm going too far. Tell me if I'm going too far. Okay, so I'm in a workshop with 6 people in this great house that you can make these beautiful things in. And you sit for a portrait under daylight for 2 minutes under a skylight. So you're, mimicking with one of those head grasp things from the 19th century, and you're sitting there mimicking this process of how people actually have their picture made. And I had mine made, and then you go into the basement and you play with all the chemistry, and the image comes up, and I hold my glass plate, and I still have it in my house, and I'm like, I look like a slave! And that's not what you shout in a workshop. You go like, look, I look like, and everyone's sort of like slowly laughing. And then I made another one, and I was like, oh, it still look like a slave. I thought it was just like a joke the first time. So for me, instantaneously, because it was a portrait of myself. It was like this process, this history. I was no longer my contemporary self. I was just chucked into this history of how a black body is reported by this process. And I sort of filed that away and didn't really, it's a very laborious, chemically, it has ether in it, so, watch lists, and all, like things you're like, oh, that doesn't seem like a lot of fun to do. But in turn, I'm jumping ahead because I know what your next question is. So, but in turn, a few weeks later was Katrina, while people were, which was really, I've never lived in New Orleans or anything like that, but the response of people to the images of black people trying to survive was return, this is what they've always deserved, this is the deluge, let the waters wash their sins away. Like in the New York Times, I have these printed out, and you're just like, well, okay, so there's something about images of black people that still keep them in this historically segregated, complicated space. And so sort of sorting through those ideas, I came through to make these images, like in a very non-logical step.
So I actually want to go first.
Okay.
So I want you to say more about the process becoming visible and the touch, like the fact that this is the mark of your physical touch images.
So okay, I'll back up a few steps. Ambrotypes are, if you know about photography or anything, they have an ISO, or I figured out the ISO for the batch of chemistry that I was making of 2. So they need a lot of light. And so for me in this process, I never used an assistant and sort of figured out ways with heavy strobes and to make all of this happen by myself. And so for me, they're small, intimate, one-of-a-kind objects, but they're very personal because I cut the glass myself, I polish the glass myself, you polish the glass for like 3 days, it's really annoying, and then you soak them, or you coat them with this ether collodion, which is like a plastic mix, and then you soak them in a silver nitrate bath. And so when you coat them, you literally have a piece of glass that's flat like this, and you hold it, you learn why it takes 2 years to learn how to process it, is like how to hold a piece of glass and not make it break, how to hold it completely parallel so you can pour liquid on it and perfectly move it like this without it coating your whole entire arm. Not putting your hands in silver nitrate baths so you can live till you're and so yes, they have in very strange ways. And then they also were, playing with the light and its source. I could record, they're all self-portraits as well. So I could play with how my skin renders. I've made, and in the show you can see them sort of pop from really light to really dark. And it's sort of me playing with my own physicality and my own skin and my own tone. And sort of, so I also see it as like, this records my body in a way that I don't even see my own body, nor do I think people see my body in real life. So it's often funny after shows, people just stare at their nose and you're like, what would you like me to do? So I mean, they're very much marked by my body. They're my babies, but yeah.
No, I'm struck by how much you are in them. And what you just said is really interesting too, though, about, and as I understand it, I'm going to ask you to say more about character recognition
Sure.
and sort of the social practice that comes out of, as well as the material practice. But if this is in part about a technology of identification, I find it striking, like, how ineffective they are for
Absolutely.
identification.
Absolutely.
I'll just, you
I don't
I'm
know.
gonna let you do that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, two parts. The other part of history that I love is there are these posters that are known as Bertillon posters, which are the first sort of mug shots or the organization of information to sort of say this is what a criminal looks like, and they're just these pictures of noses and then these pictures of eyes. And so I got the categorizations of how to photograph my face from those Bertillon things. So they thought if you had a bump on your nose on this side, that meant that you would steal an orange from the stand. Like it was illogical how, with the invention of photography, they thought that would answer so many problems. Like we can now sort through the positive and the negative and the riffraff. And we still do that with profiling and all. I mean, it's still just a modern day version of that. I forgot the second half of the question. There was something about
how you are not recognizable. Like I had to go back and I was like, did Mara use herself as a
Yeah.
model? Like I had to figure that out.
they're me. They are, I think for me, I go back to sort of like photo theory that no photograph, I don't believe photographs hold any truths, and I don't believe in narrative structure and things that get me in a lot of trouble sometimes, but I always believe that there's this performance. If there's a sitter on the other side of the camera, there's some form of performance that happens. And even, it's interesting that you put these two together, that for me, when there are mouths or when there are eyes, there's an active performance that I'm sitting at. As sitter, I'm actually really engaged in. And so there's some in which I'm crying, there's some in which I have my teeth sprayed open for like medical examination, I have my tongue sticking out, I'm smiling seductively, which sometimes comes out really just freaky, scary, weird. But, so I do believe that there's a performance that happens back out from the body that can help dictate the identification process in certain, my ear can't really perform very well, but other parts of my body.
So if the subject being photographed is also a performer, then that also cuts against the idea of the objective photographic document.
Yes.
Okay.
And this is what I remember I have to say. The title character recognition actually comes from my ex-boyfriend at the time was I really still don't even know what to call him. He was like, he worked on satellites and imaging and color things. And so he was talking about science, engineering, we worked together. But at the time he was talking about how satellites looks at army ships or army or tanks. And if they are sitting at 100%, it's 100% character recognition. That every tank, every airplane, everything in space is considered a character. Like a certain plane shape is a character, and then if it's facing this way or this way, it'd be a 65% character recognition, or like 100% character recognition. I was like, that's really interesting that this satellite from space is trying to decode, known objects based on their angle of sight. And so I was like, that's nice, okay, and I just wrote it down. He's like, why are you writing this down? And it's just this really interesting thing about how we see and how we try to sort what we see. And for me, there's a really hyper-consciousness about sorting what we see based upon race. And so that's how this body of work sort of has affected me for the last 10 years, is how do we sort, we might as well admit it, we don't like to, but we sort how we see things based on race, so let's admit it and move on.
Or move deeper in.
Or move deeper in, or figure out why we do it and not blame anything else. We just sort of say photography is a mechanism in which we do that, but we naturally do that with our own eyes. We sort what we see.
Okay, so you mentioned that as partial inspiration, the Bertillon, the grids of years that were somehow supposed to help the police identify criminals, right? Okay. So one of the things about that I think your work draws attention to is that work in some way is all about objectifying the photograph subject and finding a discrete place in which to fix and really file away in a drawer that subject, to know it, and also to know the photographed subject apart from oneself. So I guess I tend to think about that objectifying maneuver as also creating distance between self as subject and someone else's object. And what's so interesting to me about this work, about your work, is how intimate it is, like how close the camera is, I imagine, to the body. And then, again, not here, but as they're displayed in the gallery, how close as a viewer you're invited to come up on them. And so, do they strike you as intimate? Do you?
Yes, they are. Photographically, the camera, it's all math, so the camera was 9 inches away, the strobes were 14 inches away, and so it was this, and I was in this very small space, and so it was this intimate act, especially doing it alone, with all of this chemistry and stuff like that. It's also this double-edged sword, because you're asked to come up and be really close with them, but they're really fragile objects that need to be protected, and at some point I finally realized that I was breaking too many of them. Like in the process of making, I was like, these are kind of, I keep breaking them. Oh, they're one of a kind. That's gone forever. So there's this, and I think that with that materiality of it being on the black glass itself, people aren't used to objects or photographs emanating from a darkness in some way as well, which I think is confusing and alluring at the same time. So, some of the size constraints were technical constraints at the beginning, but I think it serves the whole project now. Like I since then have figured out how to make larger ones, but I've always been attracted to this thing that you hold in your hand, and it's almost a one-to-one, and you can hold it up to your face and almost feel it near your face. So.
Okay, and then, so they are made on black glass.
They are made on black glass. If your ambrotypes on clear glass can be used as a negative in the enlarger to make a print, but to make them visible in real life, just like if you want to see that, they'll always have to have a black piece of paper to make them visible. And so that just seemed like to me as an artist, like a stupid thing to make visual. I was like, well, why don't you just put it on black glass and then it's immediately visible? And everyone's like, oh. They're like, well, then you can never print it in the darkroom, but that was never my intention. So I was like, well, there was a stained glass woman in Rochester who loved me. I just bought these sheets of black glass like every 3 months. Like, I need more. So, yeah.
Okay, so how much time do we have? Okay, so do you want?
I can do it. It's going to be weird.
It's going to be weird. Here it is, it's weird.
I'll do it really tiny.
Yeah, we're doing it quickly. So, work that is not in the exhibit, but that I think is really fascinating is Myra's new series called My White Friends. And yeah, it is funny. And so I guess, well, if I just get one question about this,
kind of in the transition of me leaving Rochester and coming to Chicago in 2007. And I was, I'm going to do this as quickly as possible. It's a little complicated. But I was interested in this idea that when there was like this lusciousness and people understood race, but it was like too beautiful for them to engage with. And many of my good friends saying, I understand you're talking about race with these old things, but they're so beautiful. I just don't have to engage. Because I just will engage with the beauty and walk away. It's a character recognition. And I was also uncomfortable personally about, I got into this headspace of like commodifying my blackness as an art object. And also in the classroom, being concerned with students only placing race. The students were majoritively white, only placing race when it was not them, and never placing race when it's whiteness. And having the complete opposite experience growing up in Harlem with a family that lives in New York City and all these things where we place race all the time, and having the really conscious notion that none of my white friends placed whiteness at could see whiteness in a picture. Mm-hmm. And so I spent the next 6 years trying to, and these are really my friends, my real mentors, these are people I know dearly. She was here last night, if you were here, it's her purple pink sweater. This is taken on diversity, all French. So really getting in and seeing how could I, opposite of, there's no space, there's no context of the face in those pictures, but in these I sort of use context to work. I mean, it's a totally different process. Like color to me is something that is, color photography is invisible, just the same way that whiteness is considered invisible in culture. So for me, the material do align, and I'm giving really broad question answers, but also seeing how can I make an environment a part of that conversation about race, or how do these environmental portraits work? So that's the guy that told me about character recognition. That's my brother-in-law. That's the fastest I've ever
Thank you.
said
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Great. The quick tour. So do other people have questions?
Hi, thanks for your talk. Yeah, I was just thinking about Latoya Ruby Fraser's work and, looking at the contrast, or kind of the similarities between your work and just talking about representations of blackness and how there is this really intense racism that's still happening, especially in mainstream media outlets and in our country. And how that sort of takes on a serious tone, whereas like the white people, it's like, haha, white people, like we're laughing. It's like,
Well,
white
you're laughing because you are majoritively white,
Right, right.
My uncle, who was like, I'm surprised you haven't been lynched and burned for this project. Like, it's a very different conversation with different communities of people. And so, if I showed this to a group of students who were mostly minority, not black, but minority, and they're like, I totally get it.
Yeah.
I sit in a room knowing that I am representing, otherness and things like that in a certain way. And all I can do is to ask people to think about how they see otherness in pictures and how they might be considered other to others.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a conversation a lot of people have, but it's a really important one. Like, people don't get, like, my mother sees you as other. She grew up in this, segregated South. She will always see you as other.
Yeah.
And so it seems like haha funny, but the deeper you get into, you can't do it in 6 pictures and you can't do it in 3 minutes, but it's a complicated question as to how self plays out to otherness. And it's not just my perspective. It comes off as like a black girl just doing these things, but it can generate another conversation. And I say to Jason, I don't know, Jay, New York Times blog comments? I can give you they get deep in there. There's some shade. But it's a complicated conversation. You know, like, I think the title is positioning, and I almost, I forgot to bring it, I might have it. I have little pins that, you know, a book came out, and I made pins in their bags, and I give them away. My friend, like, different people wear the pins in the bags around, and they always get, what are you saying? Who you know, accused of, like, bad racial integrity for wearing something that describes race. White to me is merely a description. It is not then good or bad or better or worse. It is merely a description. And I couldn't pull this off if I didn't have a significant cadre of people to would be photographed. And so it's not 3 people, it's 75 from all around the country, you know, so. And then there are people who don't look white, and then people want to kick them out the club, and it's like, well, what does that mean? It's true. It's true. Everyone wants to kick him out of the club. He's pure Italian. He knows about it.
Another question, actually. It's interesting seeing this project in sequence after the character recognition ones too, and I'm struck by there's such kind of an implied like system in the sense of character recognition. It loops back to these kind of traditions of photography that very much kind of work in that way. I'm curious to hear you say a little bit more kind of about how you've chosen to kind of structure this one too, and specifically kind of how do you decide what the photograph is you make of each of your white friends? And I guess the related question is it just a single photograph of each one? And then how do you choose to represent them and all of those kind of questions? To what extent you can kind of elaborate on that?
It's not a single photograph. It is a system, and it's sort of people got on, like there was a list, and then people were added to the list. And as I made photographs, I sort of had to really look at them didactically and say, this is what it's describing or hinting at, or to make sure that there weren't too many crossovers. I think if you look at the series as a whole, there might be too many water scenes, like too many white people by lakes and bodies of water. That is my thing. And so, but like it's something I can see by looking at the project. But you know, I travel the country, and so I have to go back and sort of say, well, what is available with the scenario of these people's lives? So I go with them to work, and I go to their homes and do these things. And so many of the photographs were made and then had to be remade based on just photographic qualities and light and scenario. This photograph, this is actually here in Chicago. She was my college roommate. First time I made it, it was awful, and she's a costume designer, and her kids were in these like the wackiest homemade woven clothes, and it just like the picture it just looked like babies exploding from the picture. So I was like, okay, let's put the babies in normal clothes. And then let's come back at a better time light, and then light was better and things like that. So pictures were made and remade to make them the best thing possible. But I would just sort of sort them out, and I would write characters, I write emotions or things that I want, and sort of just targetedly go through them as I made pictures.
I'm interested in that process a lot too, in the sense of to what extent you're kind of shaping the variation and variety, and to what extent they're kind of active agents in this too. I think that's a very interesting comment.
Yeah, I'm very cautious to call these portraits because I am the queen of manipulation on these in as much as I can be. And so for me, these are often dismissed as portraits, and they're actually really kind of slightly nuanced potential scenarios. Like, I was like, we're going to make this volleyball picture, but what we're going to do first is play hours and hours of volleyball, and then we'll make this picture. Because it has to have a certain feel of realness to not.
That's really interesting too when you start, sorry, this is my last comment. Yeah, when you think about the fact that you're dealing with something that's about this seeming like lack of perception sometimes, you do not notice the whiteness and things like that too, where I think it'd be easy to look at these and overlook the fact that it also registers your kind of perceptions in a certain way too, which I think is really kind of interesting undercurrent too when I start thinking about it that way.
Available and